Imagine waking up at 2 a.m. to the sound of your front door being kicked off its hinges. It's 1631 in a tiny, quiet fishing village called Baltimore on the desolate coast of Ireland. For 237 people sleeping peacefully in their beds, this wasn't just a nightmare. It was the brutal end of their lives as they knew them. In the pitch black of a freezing Irish night, the air was suddenly filled with screams in a language nobody in the village had ever heard before. Men with torches and scimitars were dragging men, women, and children out of their warm beds and chaining them in the muddy streets while their homes burned to the ground behind them. Among the terrified crowd was a young woman named Joan Broadbrook. Joan had lived a simple life. She had never left her village, never been more than 10 miles from where she was born. She had no concept of the wider world, no idea that men from a continent she couldn't even point to on a map were coming for her in the dead of night. By sunrise, the village was empty. Silence fell over the smoldering ruins. Every single survivor was on a ship, bound for a world of unimaginable cruelty. 3 weeks later, Joan wasn't an Irish villager anymore. She was standing on a wooden platform in a slave market in Algiers, North Africa. The sun beat down on her pale skin as men circled her like merchants inspecting livestock, squeezing her arms to check for muscle, forcing her mouth open to check her teeth, treating her like property. Because now, that's exactly what she was. She sold for the price of 8 oxen. Think about that for a second. A human life. A woman with dreams and memories, valued at less than a good horse. But here's the terrifying part. Joan wasn't just unlucky, she was one of a million. This is the story history books decided to skip. We often hear about the transatlantic slave trade, and rightly so, but there is another massive chapter of human trafficking that has been conveniently forgotten. Between 1530 and 1780, over 1 million Europeans were captured and sold into slavery in North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. We're talking about Spanish, Italian, French, Portuguese, even people from as far north as Iceland. In 1627, these corsairs raided Iceland in an event known as the Turkish abductions. Imagine being a farmer near the Arctic Circle, waking up to men speaking Arabic, kicking down your door. It was terrifyingly organized and global in scale. See, the Barbary pirates weren't just random criminals with eye patches like you see in Hollywood movies. They were state-sponsored predators, an extension of naval power for the regencies of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. This was a massive, sophisticated industry. Every slave sold meant tax revenue for the Sultan. Their fleets would sail with 30 ships at a time, attacking coastal towns at dawn when defenses were weakest. In a single summer in 1544, the infamous commander Hayreddin Barbarossa captured 7,000 people in Italy. That's not a raid, that's a human harvest. They emptied entire towns. But here is where it gets truly dark, a detail often left out of the history books. They didn't do it alone. They had help from the inside. They called them renegades, Europeans who switched sides to get rich. These were men who abandoned their faith and their people for power. Men like Simon the Dancer, a Dutch captain who joined the corsairs in Algiers. He personally led raids to hunt down his own countrymen, using his knowledge of Dutch shipping routes to capture unsuspecting vessels. Nationality meant nothing to these men. Loyalty meant nothing, not when there was that much gold on the table. It was a betrayal of the highest order, neighbor selling neighbor. And once they had you, the journey to North Africa wasn't just a trip, it was a descent into hell. Let me tell you about Maria Terreland to give you a real sense of this horror. She was Dutch, just 22 years old, traveling on a merchant ship off the coast of Spain in 1731. When the pirates boarded at dawn, the violence was swift. They didn't just take everyone. They were brutally efficient calculators of human value. Men over 40, useless for hard labor, useless for sale. They were often thrown overboard to drown right there, their screams swallowed by the sea. The young men were chained for the galleys. The women were chained for the markets. And then Maria was shoved into the cargo hold.
She spent 17 agonized days down there, chained to 40 other women. The space was so tight they couldn't even lie down. They had to sit hunched against each other in total darkness. The smell was indescribable, a toxic mix of vomit, waste, stagnant water, and the stench of pure fear. No light, no fresh air, just the sound of the ship creaking and women crying in languages Maria couldn't understand. But the worst part wasn't the darkness, it was the silence that followed the death. 7 women died during that crossing due to disease and suffocation. Maria would hear the splash as their bodies were dragged up to the deck and tossed into the sea like garbage. The woman chained right next to Maria stopped eating on the 3rd day. She stopped drinking on the 5th. By the 8th day, she was gone. But in the crowded dark of the hold, the slavers didn't notice right away. Maria had to sit there, chained to a corpse for hours, feeling the body turn cold against her own, unable to move away. It was a psychological torture designed to break the spirit before they even reached land. When they finally reached Algiers and dragged her up to the deck, she hadn't seen the sun in over 2 weeks. The light was so bright it felt like needles in her eyes. But as her vision cleared, she saw the white walls of the city rising from the coast, and then she saw the market. The moment they stepped off the ship, the processing began. And make no mistake, this was an industry as bureaucratic as it was brutal. First, they were taken to public baths. They washed the captives and treated their wounds, not out of kindness, but to make sure the merchandise didn't die before the auction. Damaged slaves sold for less. Then they were sorted like cattle. If you were a strong man, you were sent to the galleys. This was essentially a slow, agonizing death sentence. You were chained to an oar, often for months at a time without being released, rowing until your heart gave out or your muscles tore. Most galley slaves died within 5 years of capture. But if you were a young woman between 15 and 30, you were the most valuable item in the market. Before the sale came the inspection, and this is the part that nightmares are made of. Women were forced onto elevated platforms in the center of the town square. Potential buyers didn't just look, they touched. They squeezed arms to check for muscle tone. They pulled open mouths to check teeth. They examined skin for scars or blemishes. In markets like Algiers and Tunis, there was no modesty. Women were put on full display, stripped of their dignity. Buyers ran their hands over bodies that didn't belong to them in front of hundreds of spectators who cheered and bid. A French friar named Pierre Don, who was there in 1634 trying to rescue captives, wrote a chilling account. He said the women were inspected like animals at a fair. If a woman cried, looked down, or tried to cover herself, the slavers beat her with sticks until she stood straight and smiled. They had to learn the most painful lesson of all. Resistance was useless. You were no longer a person. You were a product. This happened in broad daylight. It was completely legal. It was completely accepted by the society that profited from it. And for the women who passed this inspection, they were headed to a place that Western myths have completely lied to you about, the harem. When you hear the word harem, what do you see? Romantic paintings, silk cushions, beautiful women lounging in exotic luxury eating grapes? That is the Orientalist fantasy European artists sold to the world without ever stepping foot inside one. They painted what they wanted to see, not what was there. The reality was a high-security prison disguised as a palace. The imperial harem in Istanbul wasn't a bedroom, it was a massive complex inside the Topkapi Palace, a city of women holding up to 1,000 captives at a time. To get in, you had to be young, usually between 12 and 18, and stunningly beautiful. They spent years in rigorous training, learning how to walk, how to speak Turkish, how to play instruments, how to pour tea with perfect grace. But here is the brutal truth that shatters the fantasy. Out of those 1,000 women, maybe 50 would ever see the Sultan in person, and maybe 10 in an entire generation would actually spend a night with him. The rest, they lived in a permanent gilded limbo. They were spare parts in a machine built for one man's pleasure.
They spent decades waiting for a summons that never came, watching their beauty fade in golden rooms, knowing they could never leave, never marry, never have a family of their own. They were prisoners of luxury, fed well and dressed in silk, but stripped of all agency. Ottoman records tell us about a European girl named Francesca. She entered the harem in 1650.
She was 15. She died there in 1702 at the age of 67, 52 years inside those walls. She never saw the Sultan, not once. She never stepped outside the complex. Her entire life was spent serving women of higher rank, folding clothes and cleaning rooms. When she finally died, they didn't even put her name on her grave. The administrative ledger just listed her as slave number 847. Origin, Franco. Status, deceased. 52 years of life reduced to a number. That was the reality. You might think the nightmare ended if you were lucky enough to be rescued, but for women like Maria Terolan, freedom turned out to be its own kind of prison. Maria was one of the rare lucky ones. After 8 years in captivity, her family sold literally everything they owned to raise her ransom, 200 Dutch florins, a fortune that ruined them. She was finally freed in 1739. She got on a ship, she went home to Holland. But when she walked through her front door, the life she remembered was gone. Her mother had died of grief 2 years after she was taken. Her father was financially ruined from paying the ransom and was living in poverty. And the man she was supposed to marry, her fiancé, he hadn't waited. He was married to another woman with children of his own. But the cruelest cut came from her own neighbors. Instead of welcoming her back as a survivor, they treated her like she was contaminated. In their eyes, she was dishonored. The prevailing thought was that any woman who had been in a harem or enslaved in North Africa had been corrupted. No decent man would marry a woman who had been a slave. Maria lived the rest of her life alone, working as a seamstress, an outcast in her own town. In her diary, she wrote something heartbreaking. She said she would have preferred to die in captivity than return to this life of judgment. At least in Algiers, her shame was private. At home, it was public and eternal. And for Joan Broadbrook, there was no ransom. When the few survivors from that Irish raid finally tried to return years later, they found nothing. The village of Baltimore was a ghost town. It had been abandoned, left to the winds. Joan's family never knew what happened to her. Did she die on the journey? Did she survive in a harem? Did she end up as a domestic servant in a wealthy household? We will never know. For a few years, the local church read her name aloud every Sunday, praying for her return. But eventually, the reading stopped, the prayers stopped, the memory faded. She was erased from the earth. So why did Europe allow this to happen for 250 years? Why did powerful nations let their own people be harvested like crops? The answer is shameful and cynical. Europe was weak and divided. Catholics and Protestants were too busy killing each other in religious wars to unite against a common threat. The English hated the Spanish more than they hated the pirates. And worse, it was about money. Countries like France and Venice actually had profitable trade agreements with the Ottoman Empire. They didn't want to risk ruining their economy over a few captured Irish peasants or Spanish fishermen. In fact, the ransom system itself became a business. It was slow, bureaucratic, and favored the rich. If you were a wealthy merchant's daughter, you might get out in a year. If you were a poor fisherman's wife, you were forgotten. It wasn't until the 19th century, 1830 to be exact, that France finally invaded Algiers and bombed the Corsair bases, ending the system for good. But by then, the damage was done. Over 1 million Europeans had been captured. The vast majority never came home. Joan Broadbrook, the girl from Ireland, died a slave. Her family name died out in her village. Maria Terolan died alone and shamed. Francesca died a number in a ledger. This isn't just a story about pirates, it's a story about a massive human tragedy that was erased because it was too painful to remember.
The coasts of Ireland still remember the night of 1631. The archives in Istanbul still hold the names of the slaves. And now, you remember too. Every civilization has dark chapters buried in the archives, waiting to be told. Which culture should we uncover next? Let me know in the comments.